It was years ago when I decided to leave everything behind and move to a quieter place. Life in the city had become unbearable, endless noise, suffocating crowds, and a sense of emptiness that followed me everywhere. I needed solitude, a fresh start. When I found that old house on the outskirts of a small, isolated town, it felt like destiny. It was affordable, spacious, and surrounded by nature. Exactly what I needed. The first days there were idyllic. The silence was almost therapeutic, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I spent my mornings unpacking and rearranging furniture, and my evenings reading by the dim light of an antique lamp. The house had its quirks, creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, but nothing I couldn't live with. At least, that's what I thought. It wasn't until my fourth night that I noticed something odd. As I lay in bed, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from downstairs. I dismissed it as the house settling or perhaps the wind playing tricks on me. After all, old houses make noises, don't they? But deep down, something felt off. The footsteps returned the next night. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the living room below. My pulse quickened as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Who could it be? I lived alone, and the house was locked. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept downstairs, my bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The sound stopped as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs. I scanned the room, swinging the beam of light across the shadows. Nothing. Just the furniture, the curtains swaying slightly in the draft, and the faint hum of silence. Convincing myself it was my imagination, I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the sound of those footsteps over and over. The next few nights were no different. Each time, the footsteps began around the same hour. Slow, measured, as if someone were deliberately walking through the house. I checked every corner, every closet, even under the stairs, but I always found the same thing: emptiness. By the end of the week, I was beginning to question my sanity. Could I be imagining this? Or was there something, or someone, I couldn't see? The footsteps became a nightly occurrence. I began to dread the evenings, knowing they would bring the same haunting sound. They were always deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking wanted me to know they were there. I started noticing other things, too. Objects weren't where I had left them. A chair that had been neatly tucked under the dining table would be slightly pulled out the next morning. The door to the study, which I always kept shut, was sometimes ajar. Each time I noticed these things, my stomach would churn with unease, but I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I was just forgetful. One night, I decided to stay up and wait. I sat in the dark living room, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood under my weight. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the footsteps began. They started in the hallway upstairs, moving slowly toward the staircase. My breath caught as I realized the sound was coming closer, descending step by step. I shone the flashlight toward the staircase, my hands trembling. But when the sound reached the bottom, the beam of light revealed nothing. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. It was as if something was there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching me. I stayed frozen in place until the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with fear and questions. Was the house haunted? Or was there someone else living here, hiding in the shadows? The tension reached its peak a week later. That night was unusually quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps to begin. But they didn't. Instead, just as I started to relax, there was a loud knock at my bedroom door. 3 distinct, deliberate knocks. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. The door was locked. I had made sure of it before going to bed. Slowly, I sat up, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The knocks came again. 3 sharp, measured raps that echoed in the stillness. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I got up and approached the door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. Then I saw it, a folded piece of paper lying on the floor just outside my door. My hands shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. The message inside was scrawled in jagged, uneven letters, written in what looked like dried blood. "You have until dawn to leave." I dropped the note as if it had burned me, backing away until I hit the wall. My mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or a warning I couldn't afford to ignore? The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, clutching a flashlight and jumping at every little sound. The house seemed to come alive around me, with faint creaks and groans that felt more deliberate than ever. I counted the hours until dawn, and when the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the windows, I knew what I had to do. As soon as the sunlight broke through the curtains, I sprang into action. I had already decided. I wasn't staying another minute in that house. My fear outweighed my curiosity, and I wasn't going to wait to see what might happen if I ignored the warning. I hurriedly threw my belongings into a suitcase, my hands trembling so much that I dropped a few things along the way. The house was eerily quiet now, as if it knew I was leaving. That silence was almost worse than the footsteps. It felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing in the doorway, watching me pack. The air seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. By the time I zipped up my bag and grabbed my keys, my chest felt tight and my breaths were shallow. As I stepped outside, the morning air was crisp and cold, biting at my skin. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. The house was behind me now, just an old, empty shell. I locked the door, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't as if I planned to return. Driving away, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood there, silent and still, but something about it seemed alive. I pressed harder on the gas pedal and didn't look back again. It's been years since that morning, but the memory of that house still lingers. I never went back to that town. I never even told anyone the full story, afraid they'd think I was crazy. But I know what I experienced. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. I don't know who or what left that note, and I don't want to know. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. When a place tells you to leave, you listen. Even now, as I sit here recounting this story, I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know if it was the house itself or something that lived there, but whatever it was, it wanted to be left alone. If you ever find yourself in a house like that, don't make the mistake I almost did. Don't wait for more signs or try to find answers. Just leave. Some questions are better left unanswered. Looking back now, I realize how much I craved a fresh start. After years of chaos and personal setbacks, I yearned for peace, something my old life had stripped away. The idea of moving to a small town seemed perfect, almost idyllic. A quaint little house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the noise and stress of the city. It felt like exactly what I needed to heal and rebuild. The day I moved in was sunny, and the warmth of the townspeople was reassuring. Many of the neighbors came by to introduce themselves, offering smiles, handshakes, and even home-cooked meals. It was comforting, like I had stepped into a place where people still cared about one another. But then, I noticed him. He stood a little apart from the others, leaning casually against a lamppost, his eyes fixed on me. While everyone else chatted or laughed, he remained silent, his gaze unbroken. At first, I thought he was shy or perhaps just uninterested, but there was something in the intensity of his stare that unsettled me. It wasn't friendly, nor was it particularly hostile. It was empty. I forced myself to shake off the discomfort. After all, not everyone is sociable, I reasoned. Maybe he was just an eccentric local. I thanked my neighbors for their kindness and turned my focus back to unpacking. Yet, as the day wore on, I couldn't quite forget those eyes. Over the next few days, I settled into my new home, trying to make it my own. The house was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and a cozy little garden in the back. It was everything I had hoped for, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He began to appear. It wasn't every day, but often enough that I noticed. Sometimes he stood on the sidewalk across the street, staring at my house. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of him further down the road, leaning against a fence or sitting on a bench. Always the same posture, always the same unnerving gaze. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Small towns are like that, I told myself. People notice newcomers, maybe even watch them out of curiosity. But his presence felt different. It wasn't the friendly curiosity of a neighbor wanting to know more about me. It was watchful, almost predatory. One evening, as I was watering the plants in my garden, I saw him again. He was closer this time, standing just beyond the gate. My stomach twisted, but I forced a polite smile. He didn't respond, just stood there, unmoving. The watering can trembled in my hands as I hurried back inside. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. As I climbed into bed, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't spoken to me, hadn't crossed onto my property. But as I lay in the dark, I couldn't help but feel that he was still out there, somewhere, watching. It was a cold evening, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows as I settled into my armchair with a book. The house, though old, had a certain charm that made me feel at ease during the day. But at night, the creaks of the wooden floors and the groans of the settling walls took on a sinister tone. I had just reached for my cup of tea when a movement outside the window caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up. There he was, standing mere feet from the glass, his face illuminated by the dim light of the street lamp. He was closer than ever before, his gaze piercing, unblinking. My breath caught, and I froze, unable to look away. It felt like his stare pinned me to the chair, as if moving might break some unspoken boundary. Summoning courage, I stood and marched to the window, hoping my boldness would startle him. But as I reached it, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. My hands trembled as I drew the curtains shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the night was restless. Every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the groaning of the old pipes, even the whisper of the wind outside. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, clutching my phone, though I couldn't decide who I would even call. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to get some fresh air, hoping to shake off the lingering unease. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the street to my bedroom window. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't there the day before. The following nights were tense. I kept my curtains shut and my doors locked, but the sense of being watched never left me. I started avoiding my garden and even considered moving again, though I hated the idea of running from what might just be a harmless man with poor social skills. But then, one night, I woke abruptly. A chill ran down my spine as I became aware of something, a presence in the room. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the remnants of a bad dream. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw him. He stood in the corner, motionless, his figure barely visible in the shadows. His eyes, though obscured by the dim light, were unmistakable. They bore into me, unyielding and terrifying. I screamed, the sound piercing the silence of the house. Adrenaline surged through me as I threw off the blankets and bolted for the door, my feet barely touching the floor. My mind raced as I stumbled outside, yelling for help. A neighbor's porch light flickered on, and moments later, an elderly man appeared in his doorway, looking alarmed. "There's someone in my house," I cried, my voice shaking. He grabbed a flashlight and followed me back inside. But when we entered my bedroom, the man was gone. The corner where he had stood was empty, and the room was eerily quiet. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the neighbor only offered me a skeptical look. "You must have had a nightmare," he said, his tone kind but dismissive. I didn't argue. How could I explain what I knew to be true? The neighbor stayed for a while, checking every corner of the house with his flashlight. "There's nothing here," he said, shaking his head. Maybe it was just a shadow or a bad dream. I wanted to scream that it wasn't a dream, that I had seen him standing there as clearly as I saw the neighbor now. But I didn't. My hands were still trembling, and my voice felt too weak to argue. Instead, I nodded and thanked him, watching as he left, leaving me alone again in the house. I locked the door behind him, sliding the bolt into place with shaking fingers. The silence in the house was deafening, every creak of the old wood making me jump. I checked the windows, the closets, even under the bed, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had never been there. But I knew what I saw. The next morning, I decided to tell one of the other neighbors about the man, hoping for some kind of reassurance, or at least a logical explanation. "Oh, you mean Sam," the woman said, her expression turning cautious. "He's peculiar, but harmless. Just ignore him. He doesn't mean any harm." Her words did little to comfort me. Harmless. How could someone who appeared in my bedroom in the middle of the night be harmless? For the rest of the day, I stayed inside, my nerves frayed, my thoughts racing. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly glancing at the windows, expecting to see his face again. By nightfall, I knew I couldn't stay much longer. The next morning, I packed my bags. The decision to leave felt both sudden and inevitable. I couldn't explain it, but the house, the town, felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on me. I loaded my car as quickly as I could, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner where he might be hiding. But he didn't appear. There were no footsteps behind me, no lingering stares from across the street. It was as though he had vanished as abruptly as he had arrived. Driving out of town, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the road, watching me leave. But all I saw was the empty street stretching out behind me. Even now, as I recount this, I can't fully explain what happened. Was he just a disturbed man with an unhealthy obsession, or was there something more sinister at play? All I know is that the memory of his unblinking gaze still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see his face in the darkness. I haven't returned to that town, and I don't plan to. Some places, and some people, are better left behind. A few years ago, I made a decision that would change my life forever. At the time, I had no idea just how much. A new job offer came with the promise of growth, stability, and a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the chaos of the big city. The only catch: I had to move to a small, isolated town I had never even heard of before. The drive to the town was uneventful, but as I approached, I couldn't shake an odd feeling in my chest. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. No cars on the road, no children playing in the streets, just rows of old houses and the occasional figure walking briskly, their heads down as if they didn't want to be seen. The house I had rented was a modest one-story building with peeling paint and creaky steps, but it had its charm. My company had arranged everything, so all I had to do was settle in. By the time I finished unpacking, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streets were bathed in an eerie, pale orange glow from the flickering streetlights. That night, as I sat on the small couch eating a quick dinner, I heard it for the first time: whispers. They were faint at first, like the murmur of wind through the cracks in the windows, but then they grew louder. I froze, straining to hear. It sounded like voices, hushed and urgent, coming from outside. I peeked through the curtains, but the street was empty. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks on me. But something about the stillness outside made my stomach tighten. I locked the door and went to bed early, hoping that I was just overreacting. The following days passed uneventfully, at least during the daylight hours. The town was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I tried to focus on work, meeting my new colleagues and settling into a routine. They were polite but distant, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. It wasn't long before I began noticing the odd behaviors of the townspeople. Most of them hurried home before sunset, closing their doors and windows tightly as if preparing for a storm. The streets, already quiet during the day, became completely deserted at night. One afternoon, I mentioned this to a colleague over lunch. He hesitated before responding, his voice low. "It's just tradition," he said, avoiding my gaze. "We don't go out after dark. You'll understand eventually." His words sent a shiver down my spine. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were accompanied by faint footsteps, as if someone were pacing outside my house. I crept to the window, heart pounding, and peeked out. Again, there was nothing there, just the empty street bathed in dim, flickering light. I told myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By the end of the week, the whispers and footsteps had become a nightly occurrence. Sleep eluded me, and I found myself dreading the arrival of darkness. It felt as though the town itself was watching me, waiting for something to happen. By the second week, the unease that had been building since my arrival became impossible to ignore. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just murmurs. They were voices, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. One night, as I sat in the living room with the lights off, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, I saw them, shadows. At first, they seemed like tricks of the flickering streetlights, but as I watched, I realized they were moving. There were no people in the street, only those long, unnatural shadows. They darted between the lampposts and crept along the pavement, their movements quick and erratic, like they were searching for something, or someone. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when one of the shadows stretched toward my house, the breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The next morning, I stepped outside, hoping daylight would bring some sense of normalcy. That's when I noticed the marks on my front door. They looked like scratches, deep and jagged, as though something with claws had been trying to get in. I showed the marks to a neighbor, an older man who lived a few houses down. He gave me a long, hard look before muttering, "You should leave your lights on at night. They don't like the light." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That evening, I decided to take the neighbor's advice. I turned on every light in the house as the sun set, hoping to ward off whatever had been haunting me. But the lights didn't bring the comfort I'd hoped for. Instead, they cast long, ominous shadows across the walls, making the house feel even more oppressive. The whispers started earlier than usual, faint but insistent. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, like someone pacing just outside my door, but gradually growing louder, heavier. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching a flashlight, as the sounds circled the house. There were thuds on the roof, scraping noises at the windows, and once, a loud bang against the back door that made me jump. "Who's there?" I shouted, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The only reply was silence, followed by a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a warning. By the time dawn broke, I had made up my mind. Whatever was happening in that town, I didn't want to find out. The morning after that endless night, I woke up with one clear thought. I couldn't stay there another day. The house, the town, the shadows, they had all become too much. Whatever I was facing wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. I packed my belongings in a rush, tossing clothes and essentials into a suitcase without much thought. Every creak of the old house made me pause, expecting to hear the whispers again. The light of day should have comforted me, but instead, it felt thin and fleeting, as if the darkness would return at any moment. As I loaded the car, I noticed the streets were unusually empty, even for that town. Not a single neighbor came out. The curtains in their windows were drawn tight, and the only sound was the occasional gust of wind. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. When I finally started the car and drove through the quiet streets, the sense of relief was immediate but short-lived. As I passed the edge of town, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, shadows darting across the road. But when I looked again, there was nothing. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I accelerated. I didn't look back again. It's been years since I left that town, but the memory of those weeks has never faded. I've told a few people about my experience, but most of them just laugh it off, saying I must have been overworked or stressed. Maybe they're right. Or maybe they don't want to believe that places like that exist. I still don't know what I encountered there, whether it was supernatural or just something beyond my understanding. All I know is that leaving was the right choice. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers when the wind howls against my windows. It's probably nothing, but I always keep my lights on, just in case. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, where the silence is too heavy, where the darkness seems alive, don't ignore it. Listen to your instincts and leave. Some towns are best left forgotten. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.